Attends, czekajcie. Attends, czekajcie. Attends, czekajcie. Attends, czekajcie. Okay, so as I'm working on the longer type of videos,
Okay,
I think
so
as I'm working. Hey, Temujin, how's it going? So yeah, as I was saying, basically because I'm waiting to do like the longer videos, or I'm working on the longer vids, might as well give you some entertaining by responding to Marxist Leninists. But first, just so that we're sure, can everyone hear me? Can everyone hear me correctly? Okay, good, good. Yeah, so let's begin. So this is Kilim Moppin. So for those who don't know who Kilim Moppin is, just so that we're clear, Kilim Moppin is a man that I just find very interesting because, for one, he claims to be like an anti-imperialist, but for some weird reason, like he'll support like Russia doing exactly what say American neocons did in say Iraq or even in all of Latin America during the Cold War. And so he was basically saying, "Oh well, don't worry, Russia will not invade Ukraine. Russia will not invade Ukraine." I mean, to some extent, I mean, I guess he couldn't know because he's not a seer. But when Russia did indeed invade Ukraine, he basically defended it, which for an anti-imperialist I just find very interesting because if you're a real anti-imperialist, you would technically be against like these sort of military operations to take land or who base themselves on like this sort of quote unquote blood and soil rhetoric if we really want to go there. Um, and yeah, basically he just like went there and said, yeah, Russia is doing everything fine. Basically, Ukraine kind of deserves it, and I don't know, just like a massive just hate boner for Ukrainians, I guess. So let's just start this and see what he's got to say. So this is breaking down Putin's Ukraine speech.
All right. Now, a couple other points I want to address. Putin gave a very good speech, very well thought out, intricate, speech that he gave, on before recognizing Donetsk and Luhansk. It was a long speech, and it was compared to anything that any U.S. leader has given. I mean, this was a very complex speech. He got into the history of Ukraine, how it was formed, and
Yeah, how it was formed. How it was formed as in his position of how of in his view how it was formed, but now not exactly like really historically accurate. Just to check. Hey there, Natya. Hey then, Respublikansky Ukrainians. How's everything going there? Because I know you're an actual Ukrainian. Because you were actually in Ukraine. But just a big question. Can everyone hear the video? I'll wait a bit because I know there's like a delay. So okay, so everyone can hear the video. Okay. Yeah, sorry if I'm being like a bit a bit uneasy. This is my first time streaming, so yeah, I'm kind of like I'm kind of nervous a little bit, but everything will go with the flow, I guess, later on. Oh, dobre, dobre. Alrighty.
And what's been happening, and it was hard hitting. This guy did his homework, he brought facts, and he laid it all on the table.
Oh yeah.
I don't know of any US president who has ever given a speech anywhere near as intricate, as well thought out, containing so many facts as what Putin did. Go and watch Putin's speech for yourself. Right? It was a great speech. And for a while, they were showing it on CNN, and then they were like, oh shit, kill it, kill it. People in America might hear this and realize.
Okay, I'm not completely sure. I'm not sure if this is true or not. I genuinely don't know since I don't live in the U.S. But yeah.
Not only that he actually has a lot of very good points, but also that our leaders are fucking retarded and Putin's a genius. I mean, this is like Putin's a very, very smart man. I have been in the same room as Putin 3 or 4 times.
Yeah, was he smart during? I mean, I don't wanna necessarily go there, but I don't think that he did some smart moves when he kind of laughed at the whole Kursk submarine incident, or his management of the siege of Beslan. But yeah, go ahead. Tell us how he's a genius, Maupin.
He's a very intelligent person. He is not a fool. He's a brilliant man, a brilliant strategist, very, very well informed about.
Yeah, we see that he's a great strategist. Look at how the special military operation is doing. The Russians can't even advance. They're stuck on they're stuck literally in the middle of Ukraine. They haven't advanced for months and they're losing territory. But yeah, keep telling how this is good for Russia, Maupin.
Geopolitics, economics. This guy knows his shit. And he knows what he's doing. And he rescued Russia from the disaster of the 1990s with economic planning. He developed a model for rescuing Russia's economy with gas.
Well, that's not completely untrue. It's sort of misleading because all he did was basically just follow the recipe that Boris Yeltsin kind of did. I mean, obviously there's like some differences with what Yeltsin did, but he still followed kind of the same recipe. It's the same kind of neoliberalism, kind of stronghold like European capitalism that you see all over Europe after, basically kind of after the Second World War and kind of during the Cold War. So I don't even understand why you, as a communist mob, and you're praising this. Like, I just don't understand. I mean, yeah, it's true that he saved like Russia from being in very strong turmoil. That I guess you can commend. And I think if he had stood down from being president later on, I think he would have got on to be one of the greatest presidents that Russia has ever had in the 20th to 21st century. But today, I mean, I don't know. There's plenty of Russians who aren't okay with what he's doing right now, but I guess you're not gonna talk about them though.
Gazprom and Rosneft, and this guy is a very, very effective strategic negotiator, strategic planner. He's really into geopolitics. He knows his stuff. And Putin, before he recognized, he knew the United States was going to come down on him. He had to explain how he was going to do it, and so he gave a speech. And I have seen so many people misrepresenting this speech. Okay, is Putin a communist? Of course not. Of course he's not a communist. Putin is not a communist. If you think Putin's a communist, you are deeply misinformed. But Putin is not a communist, and it wasn't a communist speech per se, but the speech said a lot of things that a communist could agree with. One thing that it pointed out was that the fall of the Soviet Union was a disaster for the entire region.
Mon dentiste m'a parlé d'un dentifrice pour mes gencives. Arthrodon avec des ingrédients d'origine naturelle. Arthrodon qui réduit les saignements occasionnels.
Arthrodon classique.
Voilà, classique.
Classique. Le dentifrice Arthrodon classique réduit de 72% les saignements occasionnels des gencives. Arthrodon, gencives et solutions.
YouTube.
Right? All my life, I've been told that, communism failed. Communism didn't work. And in 1991, Russia got freedom. It's been so amazing when Russia got free. And, communism was just nothing but starvation and death and misery. That's not what Putin said in his speech. Putin talked.
Well, I mean, let's put some context to why he said that the USSR was a catastrophe. Now, you can say eventually that it's a catastrophe because you're going from one economic model to another. So eventually there needs to be like some long adaptations to do, and your country is indeed going to know some form of crisis because you need to adapt yourself to the newer economic model that people want to go to. So you're going from a socialist production to a more capitalist production, and eventually that did create like a very strong economic crisis, which I agree. Every single ex-SSR went through a strong turmoil, and to some extent, there are some countries who are still in like kind of like a very bad place. I'm looking at Moldova, for example. Um, but to some extent, you can also say that it was kind of positive for these countries because they could kind of finally take their destiny into their own hands. Now, is it completely positive? Is it completely negative? I think it's quite, there's more of a gray, kind of gray area there. You could probably debate that it's positive and negative in the same time because it's positive. Yes, you got, you're independent from, say, Moscow. And basically, like, you're the ones that are taking control over your country. But in the same time, you're eventually, yes, you are poor economically, so you need to rely on like more bigger states to kind of keep afloat. So that, I guess you could say, is a negative. Um, but to sit here and tell me that the USSR was like 100% positive with no ills, regardless of if we want to talk about, say, the big stuff that happened in the 30s, regardless of that, to say that like it was completely nice and and basically paradise on earth is kind of misleading, though. I would say that the USSR was really no different than any empire, really, that existed at that time. Um, and to some extent, like there was like problems with the minorities, which the Russians really didn't want to deal with and tried to put it kind of under the carpet, and um, and basically kind of let it afloat. So no, the USSR was not 100% great, and to some extent, like I would say that I would say that like all these like more independent social states were actually far better than the USSR. Places like the Seychelles, for example, who kind of had like their own control over their own state. They had more of a culturalist position of how to do things, and so on and so forth. Well, the USSR was basically just well, they just technically just said everything was centralized in Moscow, and Moscow was basically saying to the other states um, how to basically kind of manage their stuff. Knowing that if you look at places like Kazakhstan, if you look at places like Estonia, it's not Russia, and they have a very different way of doing things. And I think that it would have been, or at least their socialism could have been a bit more successful, if you want, if they had their own stuff into their own hands. That means if they had a more culturalistic system to base themselves about. But that I guess might be a conversation for another day.
Talked about how the Soviet Union built Ukraine. The Soviet Union industrialized Ukraine.
I mean, he's going to get into like more detail, but no, the Soviet Union did not make Ukraine. But I'll let him rant to why he says this.
The Soviet Union created the modern Ukraine, and in fact, it was Lenin who drew the borders for what is now Ukraine, and then
that is not true. That is actually a lie. The first map of Ukraine was actually made by Mikhailo Khrushchevsky, who was basically the first president of Ukraine, of the Ukrainian People's Republic in 1917. So no, Caleb, you're just lying at this point. Now, Lenin did not really make anything for Ukraine. He did like some nice speeches, and he tried to make concessions to like Ukrainian communists who basically wanted a form of Ukrainian independence. But I mean, most of the Ukrainian territory was already drawn by Ukrainian activists either in the 19th century or prior. So what are you talking about?
Khrushchev added Crimea, and Stalin added some other parts of it, and it.
Well, it's not untrue that Khrushchev basically like put Crimea within Ukraine. However, you're missing like one key point of like history is that even if Khrushchev wasn't in the picture and say basically like the USSR never formed, there were already talks between the Ukrainian People's Republic and the Crimean People's Republic to basically make a union. So not to mention that like Crimea is technically like closer to Ukraine geographically, So it made more sense for Ukraine to probably have like a union with Crimea than say Russia, which is further away and isn't even connected geographically to the land.
And there would not be a country known as Ukraine if it wasn't for the Bolsheviks.
That's not true. Again, like Ukraine fought an entire war of independence from 1917 to 1921. So what are you talking about? Say the Bolsheviks lose, Ukraine would probably be a country, just like how Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania were when they won their wars of independence. Even Finland, I would say, even Finland, or even say if we look at any other empire from the period of 1914 up to the 1920s, like say the Arab states after the Arab Revolt, Ireland in 1916. These countries had a revolution against their respective empires. They won. They're still here. So I don't see why there wouldn't be a country called Ukraine if, say, they win against both the whites and the reds.
That the Bolshevik national policy of recognizing different nationalities is responsible for the creation of modern Ukraine, and the Soviet Union industrialized Ukraine.
Well, indeed, the Soviet Union did industrialize Ukraine. There were already industrialization projects made by the UPR. So, again, whether the Soviets existed or not, Ukraine would be industrialized nonetheless. Maybe not to the same extent as it is today, because people need to remember is that in the 20s in Eastern Europe, a lot of the politicians were actually agrarians. So there was more emphasis on the majority peasant population than, say, the proletariat, who were more of a minority within these countries.
I bet you didn't know that at one point, Ukraine had the world's largest hydroelectrical power plant. The biggest power plant in the world was in Ukraine. And you know who built it? Stalin, during the
Okay, so
5-year plans. They built the Dnieper Dam. The biggest hydroelectrical power plant in the world was built in Ukraine. Under the Soviet Union, Ukraine was fully electrified. Under the Soviet Union, Ukraine was fully industrialized. They wiped out illiteracy. They brought running water and electricity.
Illiteracy was already pretty much wiped out by the UPR policies. So what are you talking about, Caleb? Let's mention that there were a lot of like projects during the Russian Empire where Ukrainian activists would actually go to the Ukrainian peasants and actually would help them with literacy projects. Basically, like, yeah, there were basically like all these policies that you're talking about prior. So what are you talking about? It's the same thing. Like you're saying, like, oh, well, the USSR industrialized and electrified Ukraine. I don't see how the Ukrainian People's Republic under Petlura or any other successor would have not industrialized or electrified Ukraine. Where is this coming from? I just don't understand. Why is he belittling Ukrainians like this? Like I just don't understand.
Electricity to the whole country. The Soviet Union, socialism created Ukraine. And since Western capitalism has come back into Ukraine, Ukraine has gotten poorer and poorer and poorer, right? And that the fall of the Soviet Union devastated Ukraine economically. Putin talked about all of that in his speech. You will never hear that on American television. They never want to acknowledge basic economic data. Ukraine under the Soviet Union, good. Ukraine since the fall of the Soviet Union, bad.
I mean, Ukraine had problems in both those areas. Number one, Ukraine under the Soviet Union wasn't even economically independent. They were dependent on Moscow. I mean, today it's obviously like it's kind of different. They're not entirely dependently economic because we base ourselves on a global capitalist system, and eventually, yes, we do need to get like some form of. I mean, yeah, every country in the world which is not a massive superpower relies on somebody else. But again, like, how is this any different from the last system? Like, I just don't understand at this point.
It's basic economic data. Life expectancy has gone down. Living conditions have gotten worse. That's a basic fact. If you compare life,
that's sort of debatable. I mean, maybe in the early. I mean, I don't know in what period he's talking about necessarily. Like today, yeah, there's still problems, but I mean, it's not like on the verge of like a massive. It's not mass poor either. Like I don't know where is he? What is his reference here? Like I just don't understand.
Life in Ukraine at the time of the Soviet Union to life in Ukraine. Ever since then, life has gotten worse. And poll after poll after poll has shown that Ukrainians, even ones that are virulently anti-Russian, admit that life was better under the Soviet Union. Putin.
Well, there is some form of, I'm not denying that like there is like some form of like nostalgia for the past. Because there is, eventually, yeah, because there's a lot of social programs, for example, that have been abandoned, which you could say were probably better in the USSR. But again, like I don't understand why, say, like in an independent Ukraine, couldn't possibly make like these same policies. Like a lot of Ukrainians today who are more like social democratic or quote unquote democratic sources, even nationalists, like actually support like some form of social democracy. But I don't think that Kilimpopin is like for basically social democrats making these sort of policies, because he's more of like a Marxist Leninist. And so from his perspective, like only the Marxist Leninists can bring this up. I mean, like any political like party or political movement can bring back social programs. But yeah, I agree that like the neoliberal policies of the last like couple of years aren't that great. But there's been like progress in all these fields. There's been talks and debates over if there should be like social programs, and actually there are certain social programs such as in the medical field, for the country. So I don't even know where he's coming from. I don't understand what polls is he referencing. I would like to see what polls he's referencing, basically.
Recognized that and said that the fall of the Soviet Union has been bad for Ukraine. It's been bad for the whole region. If that is not a pro-communist talking point, I don't know what is.
That's not necessarily a pro-communist talking point, but I'll let him.
But everyone's focusing on a point that Putin made, criticizing Vladimir Lenin, which is completely fair, right? And I think Putin has a point. Now, obviously, Zhuganov and the leaders of the Communist Party, they don't agree with this. And that's okay. We can disagree, right? But I think Putin has a point when he says that Lenin's obsession with labeling different peoples throughout the Soviet Union as nationalities weakened the Soviet Union.
Uh-oh. We're getting into the juicy stuff here, right?
Now that is a point that Putin has. This isn't the first time he said this. He said this many times, that, Lenin, right? First of all, under Karl Marx, there was no nationalism. Karl Marx was opposed to all.
There was nationalism under Karl Marx. Like, what are you saying, Caleb? Nationalism basically kind of existed since the dawn of time. Like, as long as a man has a state, or a territory, say, he makes territory, he makes his own culture, and so on. Basically, by the end of the day, like, there are some people that are going to say, maybe we want to defend this. And this is what we saw like throughout history. Like, maybe the Gauls defending themselves against the Romans, the Iceni against the Romans, the Saxon against the Romans, or even later on, such as in the medieval period, where there was strifes against like various expanding kingdoms. People were basically defending their territory to not be engulfed within like a bigger landmass of those kingdoms that were expanding. Nationalism isn't something that just created itself in 1848. Like, there was already like some form of national thinking prior. It wasn't called nationalism, but I mean, I think if you analyze it like a little bit like differently from a say 1848 perspective, you could probably say that this was nationalism. Like people like Rákosi in Hungary, people like Gustav Vasa in Sweden. Sure, there were kings, but you could probably say that they were basically like guiding a sort of nationalist movement, even if it was in the Middle Ages. So I don't understand where this is coming from.
All nationalism. He said it's just the workers against the bosses. Workers of the world unite. And in the final years of Marx's life, he started to say, maybe I'm wrong about that, because he realized that the Irish people were being oppressed. And they weren't being oppressed just because they're workers. They were being oppressed on the basis of being Irish, of their Irish nationality. In a lot of cases, they were being oppressed because they were Roman Catholics. And so Karl Marx started to argue that Irish nationalism, even though it wasn't communist, was progressive. And Karl Marx's daughter started wearing a crucifix around her neck to support the Irish people. And in England, in London, they used to hang Irish revolutionary fighters. They used to hang Irish people who had fought for their country. They would drag them to London and they would hang them in the public square. And Jenny Marx, Karl Marx's daughter, put a crucifix around her neck.
Le menu hold-up à 9,99 €, c'est une salade d'accueil, un plat et un dessert ou une boisson. Ici commence l'Amérique.
Protested against these executions of Irish revolutionaries. And if you can imagine about how unpopular that might be, you know, they're going to drag some Irish revolutionaries into some big square in London, and they're going to hang them, and there's all these people that are excited to watch them hanged, and you're standing outside there with a sign saying freedom for Ireland, you're protesting that it takes courage. And especially if you're Jenny Marx, the daughter of Karl Marx, you're not born in London. That's some heroic activity. And
okay, what he basically said about the Irish, which is true, the Irish were indeed oppressed by the English government, and that is true. That, you know, eventually, yeah, he supports Ireland, and I as well. I do support the Irish people and them rising up against their oppression. But Caleb, you know who else went through that same persecution that the Irish went through? A lot of the people in the Russian Empire, and then afterwards in the Soviet Union. But, you know, he's not gonna bring this up though, because, well, of course he supports basically like Russia controlling basically Eastern Europe, Central Asia, and the Caucasus. But yeah, I mean, basically I don't understand why you'll support the Irish, but basically you'll say, nah, the Central Asians, Caucasian peoples, and peoples of Eastern Europe who are in Russia deserve to be under Russian boots, though. I just don't understand. This is some double standards right there. I mean, again, we support the Irish people. Yeah, eventually, yeah, the Irish people did rise up, but you know who else did? Ukrainians did, Chechens did, the Avars did. A lot of these people who were under the Russian Empire for thousands of years, sorry, thousands of years, not million, but thousands of years, also rose up against their oppression.
Karl Marx, in his final years, came to understand that the Irish people fighting for their national liberation as Irish people, even if they weren't communists, even if they weren't socialists, even if they weren't revolutionaries. I mean, they were revolutionaries, but if they were revolutionaries on their national basis, on the basis of their nationalism, that was correct. And I believe Karl Marx also began to support the people of Poland and in their, you know, national.
Yep, basically, Marx supported the Poles basically because they were very heavily inspired by Jacobinism, while basically he called other Eastern European peoples basically backwards. Yeah, that was Karl Marx basically. He said the only Slavs with revolutionary potential are basically like Poles, and the rest are basically too reactionary, so they shouldn't be supported. Yeah, that's how great Karl Marx was.
Liberation aspirations. And so Marx died, but Lenin, studying Marx's writings on the Irish question, studying Marx's teachings about Poland and looking into it, Lenin wrote his very famous thesis on the national question. And Lenin argued that oppressed nations fighting for their national liberation was progressive and should be supported. And he came to that conclusion. And Rosa Luxemburg vehemently disagreed with Karl Marx about that. Rosa Luxemburg said, no, all nationalism is inherently reactionary. All nationalism is inherently reactionary.
Technically speaking, Marx also kind of viewed like a lot of nationalist movements as reactionary. I mean, this is kind of like my beef with a lot of left-wing nationalists, is that a lot of left-wing nationalists are Marxists without understanding that a lot of Marxists are inherently opposed to nationalism. So technically, TLDR, left-wing nationalism and Marxism are kind of incompatible.
You know, she disagreed with him. A lot of Marxists disagreed with Lenin on that point, but that became the position of the Bolshevik Party, was that all nations have the right to national liberation.
And yeah, that was a ruse. I'm rereading Shakrai because again, I mean, I'm translating it as we speak, and basically, yeah, the Bolsheviks didn't really support actually these national policies. They just used it as like a ruse to get people supporting the Bolsheviks. Otherwise, afterwards, when they took power, you basically could say goodbye to your national aspirations, because you would be basically called bourgeois, you would be called like a reactionary and so on, and you just end up ending up being purged.
And what Putin argued in his speech is that belief that all nations have the right to national liberation, he took it a bit too far. And that when the Bolsheviks came to power in Russia, they went to all the different peoples throughout the Soviet Union and they started declaring them to be nations. And in doing that, he planted the seeds of dividing the peoples of the region. Right?
Just see how he basically calls like Russia as basically like Eastern Europe, the Caucasus, and Central Asia as regions of Russia. He kind of points out that they're regions of Russia. Caleb, like Central Asia, the Caucasus, and I mean technically number one, they're not Russians, they're not Slavs. They're basically their own peoples who have their own culture and who have their own national history prior to being invaded by the Russian Empire. Number two, if we are to talk about Eastern Europe, number one, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia are Baltic peoples, so they have no connection to basically like Russia at all. Finland as well, by the way, because Finland is a Finno-Uralic group, and Belarus and Ukraine are also their separate cultures away from Russia. Trust me, we have nothing in common. The only thing we have in common is that we might have lived like in like a bigger state, which was Kievan Rus at that point. But afterwards, when Kievan Rus fell, our cultures developed separately. It's only when Russia basically annexed its border westward that you could say, oh, well, yeah, Ukraine and Belarus live together. Yeah, but that's because Russia expanded into our territory. We didn't want to live with them.
For example, Belarus. What is Belarus?
Uh-oh.
What is Belarus? It's white Russia. Right?
Okay, let me be a Belarusian nationalist, even though I'm not Belarusian. Let me be a Belarusian nationalist for 2 seconds. Belarus is not white Russia. It's white Ruthenia, but it's not white Russia.
So, you know, it's Russia. It's just white Russia, right? It's just the part of the country, you know. So is Belarus...
Again, it's white Ruthenia, not white Russia.
A separate nation? I don't know. I mean...
The answer is yes. It is a separate nation for, number one, its first development as a state begins with the Principality of Polotsk. And from the Principality of Polotsk, they kind of had like some form of dominion over the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. Some historians kind of disagree because it's kind of used sometimes by ultra-nationalist Belarusians to say Lithuania is actually Belarus, because there were some Belarusian Ruthenian noblemen who basically controlled the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. But technically speaking, if we look at like the history of the Principality of Polotsk, yes, Belarus, technically speaking, it's its own nation. It's its own thing. The problem is a lot of its society and a lot of its culture has been Russified due to basically thousands of years under the Russian Empire and later on the Soviet Union. But otherwise, if Belarusians have their own language, which is very different from Russian. It's actually more closer to say what we say Ruthenian Slavic language, so Karpatho-Russian or Ukrainian. This is why we kind of sort of mutually understand each other better than with Russians. I mean, I remember watching a video where someone basically started speaking Belarusian to a Russian, and the Russian in Belarus basically say, "Dude, can you speak like Russian or English? What are you, like some form of terrorist?" So I mean, it just shows that basically, yeah, it kind of shows that, yeah, I mean, a lot of say Russian expansionists basically are kind of scared of like Ukrainian or Belarusian identity. This is just a way for basically pro-Russian people to kind of downplay like Belarus or Ukraine and just say, well, Russia has a right to control these places because basically like Ukrainians and Belarusians being Eastern Slavs, they're no different than the Russians, but we are actually quite different.
Alexander Lukashenko certainly thinks it does, and I wouldn't feel comfortable as somebody who's not from there and doesn't speak the language and has no idea.
Yet you're speaking with authority on what Ukraine is basically Russia, but go on.
Yeah, I would never feel comfortable going up to a Belarusian and saying, "You're not a nation. You know, it's just a part of Russia. It's white Russia." I wouldn't feel comfortable saying that. I don't know enough about it. I'm not from there. All right? I don't know.
Jesus, so I have an opinion.
But it is a little bit weird that Belarus means white Russia. And the Ukrainian language is very close to the Russian language.
Yes, because technically speaking, the Eastern Slavic languages all come from basically Old Slavonic. Technically speaking, so but there have been differences afterwards in history because the languages kind of evolved separately.
And, you know, there's Moldova, there's other regions, and basically...
Is he trying to say that Moldova is a Slavic country and Moldova is a Latin country? They don't speak Russian, and I mean they speak. I mean there is like some Russian speaking populations in Moldova because there are descendants of Russians there, but Moldova is a Latin country. It's not a Slavic country, so no, Moldova is not Russia.
Basically, Putin argued that by going around to all of these groups in the Soviet Union, and by saying you're a nation and you're going to have your own language and you're going to have, you know, your own national identity.
They already had their own language. Lenin didn't invent anything. They already had their own language, and they were already, after the fall of the Russian Empire, were already basically putting in national programs in their own respective languages before Lenin ever came to these peoples. What are you talking about, Kalen?
Identity, and we're going to have a house of nationalities in the Soviet government. We're going to have the Supreme Soviet on the one hand, and then we're going to have the Soviet of nationalities, and we're going to give every nation one of their own seats, and they're going to be a nation. That by doing this, he wasn't bringing the people together.
Pour les fêtes avec Jeff de Bruges, que vous soyez raisonnable, gourmand ou très gourmand.
That's what Putin argued. And that might be right. I don't know. I'm not from there. I've been over there a few times, and I don't feel comfortable saying that Putin is necessarily wrong about this. He might be right. He might be wrong. He might be right.
Yeah. I'll tell you right now, he's wrong because he's just using this as a way to justify Russian expansion. That's all he's doing.
You know, but that was a very big part of what the Bolsheviks believed, right? As they referred to the Tsarist Empire as a prison house of nations. And they really believed that one of the main points of their revolution was going to these different nationalities and giving them their own. And these people, they wouldn't even have their own, a lot of them wouldn't have their own written language if it wasn't.
What are you talking about? A lot of these peoples already had like written languages. They were already putting them into standard once the Russian Empire fell. Prior to the Bolshevik campaigns of reconquering land that the Russian Empire was losing.
For the Bolsheviks, going to these various nationalities and uplifting them on a national basis. And let's not forget that, you know, the most important book written on the question of nationalities was not written by Lenin, because Lenin was a Russian. And Lenin was a Russian. He had some Jewish heritage, but he was ethnically Russian for the most part. And Lenin didn't feel comfortable writing the book on nationalities. So who wrote it? Stalin. Why? Why did Stalin write the book The book on the national question, published by the Bolsheviks, was written by Stalin. And why was it written by Stalin? Stalin wasn't Russian. Yeah, I know that's a shocker, right? How can Stalin not be Russian? He was the leader of the Soviet Union. Stalin wasn't Russian. Stalin was not Russian. Stalin wasn't Russian. Stalin was Georgian.
Well, it's true that Stalin was Georgian. If you look at what happens to Stalin when once he gets into power, he basically sort of Russifies himself. Well, you can say, technically speaking, that yes, it's true that Stalin was Georgian, and he wasn't Russian. However, he basically kind of self-Russified himself and basically made everything centralized within Russia, made basically Moscow the ultimate capital, and was pretty much against any form of national determination within like the communist parties of the various republics composing the Soviet Union. I mean, he helped liquidate a lot of national communists. For example, he liquefied Serhiy Mazlakh in Ukraine. He liquefied Onduk Kular in Tuva. Basically, people like Anandin Amar in Mongolia and Gedin in Mongolia as well. Gedin, by the way, was the only guy who basically had the guts to actually slap Stalin because he was acting basically like a Tsar. Gedin, to Stalin's face, basically said, "You're becoming virtually a Russian Tsar." So I mean, there was a sort of process of Russification within Stalin's actions and Stalin's way of thinking, should I say.
Stalin was from Georgia, and not from the state next to Alabama either. He's from Georgia in Central Asia.
Caucasus, not Central Asia.
Stalin was from Georgia, the oppressed nation of Georgia, which was declared a nation by the Soviet Union, had a seat in the House of Nationalities. Stalin was from Georgia. He was a Georgian.
I mean, technically speaking, Georgia was already a nation since they proclaimed independence once the Russian Empire falls. So again, the Soviet Union did not proclaim Georgia to be a nation. They might have recognized the nationhood of Georgia, again, as a way to basically say, yeah, we're kind of your friends, but actually we want your territory, basically come back to us, so that we have basically a new landmass. But I mean, in reality, it was basically just a geopolitical kind of diplomatic game that they were playing.
I heard it in the speech I was watching, and he said in the speech, he said, you know, it's so ironic that modern Ukraine was created by the Soviet Union, right?
Again, not created by the Soviet Union. Ukraine was once again created or at least was proclaimed independent as a nation in 1917 by the Ukrainian Central Rada, which were all actually like Ukrainian socialists, who were sure they weren't Bolsheviks, but they were pretty much like socialists, even I would say Marxists, who did proclaim like Ukraine in 1917. They even brought a map to the Paris Peace Conference. So again, the Soviet Union did not proclaim Ukraine as a nation. I don't know where he's getting this information from.
It was Lenin who basically declared, you know, that Ukraine would be a separate republic in the Union of...
Again, Ukraine was independent already. They only got invaded by Trotsky's army, but they were already an independent country. Many countries recognized the independence of Ukraine, actually.
Soviet republics, and that added certain territory to it. And Stalin added other territory to it.
Territory that was already written within the map of Ukraine brought to the Paris Peace Conference of 1918.
To it. And Khrushchev added Crimea to Ukraine. Crimea would never have been considered part of Ukraine, but Khrushchev...
Again, there were talks between the Ukrainian People's Republic and Crimean People's Republic for a potential unification. Chelyby-Jihan was even more supportive, was actually supportive of it.
Khrushchev, for whatever reason, changed the borders of Ukraine and put Crimea in it. And so Putin remarked, he said, it's so funny that these people that are Ukrainian nationalists are constantly talking about decommunization.
Because basically they see communism as kind of, they see communism as a form of imperialism. To be more precise, they consider more Soviet communism to be a form of imperialism. So, yeah, you can't really blame them for not wanting reminders of it.
Because there wouldn't be a Ukraine if it weren't for communism.
There actually would if well, there actually would because they were standing they basically declared again. They basically declared nationhood in 1917. So, say Ukraine wins the War of Independence in 1921, there would technically be a Ukraine.
Lenin, the guy who created modern Ukraine, they're tearing down all the statues to him. They're tearing down.
Again, he did not create modern Ukraine. Like he's at this point, like he's just repeating the same nonsense to his audience at this point.
Down all the statues to Lenin, and they're tearing down all the statues to Stalin, and they're tearing down all the Soviet memorials. And again, there would not be a modern Ukraine if it weren't for the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union designed it. And he said, so these people really want to decommunize. Maybe we will. And he was hinting at the fact that, if these people really, really want to completely decommunize, then they'll be absorbed back into Russia. Because, again, it's actually a pretty...
I mean, Jesus. I mean, at this point, like, you're just being petty. And he's basically just supporting, like, Russian expansionism. And, yeah, Caleb, you're actually making more Tsarist talking points than Marxist-Leninist ones. Because Marxist-Leninists, while they don't really like Ukraine, they'll still, like, say, yeah, we support, like, Ukraine fighting... Yeah, basically the Ukrainian people fighting against the Russian invasion. So, I mean... At this point, just stop calling yourself a communist at this point. Like, I don't know. Just call yourself a Tsarist or something.
Good remark. It's a pretty sophisticated dig. It's a pretty sophisticated dig.
When you know history of the region, it really isn't. It's just Tsarist propaganda. It's really just Black Hundreds, like, talking points.
There would be no Ukraine if it weren't for the Soviet Union. If it weren't for Lenin and Stalin and Khrushchev, there would be no Ukraine. And these people are always tearing down the memorials to Lenin and Stalin and Khrushchev and people like that who built modern Ukraine. And he says, so if these people really want to decommunize, maybe we can make that happen. It's a dig. It's a dig. It was brilliant. It's a brilliant dig.
It really isn't.
Basically, he said, we created your ass. We created your ass. Okay. And, you want to get communism completely out of Ukraine? Well, liquidate Ukraine then, because communism made you guys. That's what he's saying. It's a brilliant dig, actually. It's a very sophisticated dig. And it's a very good point. And I mean, and with Ukraine threatening Russia, with Ukraine tearing down all the memorials to communism. And he says, I think, you really want to decommunize because we decommunize, then there's no more Ukraine. That's the point he was making. And that's a fair point, I think.
Was it a fair point? It's like if, say, I don't know, say like some country from like the ex-Austro-Hungarian Empire said, oh well, we're going to take down like all the monuments to like the Habsburgs, and Austria gets like ass mad for no apparent reason and says, yeah, we're gonna invade, say, I don't know, like Hungary because they're like throwing away the Habsburg all the Habsburg monuments. Like it's not a good point. Like it's just like it's basically saying, no, this was our territory, you can't just do whatever you want with it. And basically, technically speaking, the good response is saying, yeah, you might have like invaded us, but this was our land before your expansion. So no, you can't just come here and just punch us in the face because we're ripping up like Lenin and Stalin's statues. Even though like like Ukrainians have a very good reason to not like Lenin and Stalin, because Lenin basically supported the invasion of Ukraine back in 1917 when they were basically like an independent country, and should I say a socialist country by that point, because again, Khrushchevsky, Vinichenko, and Simon Petlura were all socialists from the same socialist party that were actually making like a lot of policies for independent Ukraine. Again, like socialism did indeed, like, if you want, like, made Ukraine, but it was Ukrainian socialism. It was not communism or Bolshevism that made Ukraine.
I think it's a fair point, right? And again, I see that misrepresented. Keep seeing this misrepresented online by, people are saying, oh, it was a fiery anti-communist speech. No.
To some extent, I mean, as someone who's not a Marxian communist, yeah, you could actually say that it was a pretty anti-communist speech.
It was a speech on the history of Russia and Ukraine, It was a speech about how the fall of the Soviet Union was bad. It was a speech about how Ukraine has economically suffered because of the fall of the Soviet Union. It was a speech about how the crazy anti-communist government in Ukraine is kind of hypocritical. I'm not hearing this as like a crazy anti-communist speech. Now, there were some things that people have taken issue with about, the fall of the Tsar, right? Now, the Tsar was actually toppled in the February Revolution rather than the October Revolution. There's things you can nitpick about, okay? And that's fine. And that's for the Russians to do. It's not for me to do. I'm not Russian. I'm not Ukrainian. I'm not going to get into that.
But you're not Russian nor Ukrainian. You don't want to get into that. But you're speaking with very strong confidence that basically Ukraine is apparently like a Russian region. Like Kevin, make up your mind.
But it was a pretty damn good speech. I would say that Putin is far smarter than any president we've had in the United States in the last 50, 60, maybe even 100 years, okay? Our presidents compared to Putin are dumb, okay? Putin is a very intelligent man. This is a really smart man. He means what he says and he says what he means. He thinks through things very, very carefully. He's very, very calculated. He knows what he's doing. There's a reason CNN, they were playing him. He was making his points and they're like, chill it. And they pulled him off of there because he was making sense. And he wasn't even reading from cue cards. People noticed he wasn't reading from a teleprompter. He wasn't even reading from a goddamn teleprompter. It's a damn good speech. And you can agree with it. You can disagree with it. But it was a damn good speech. It was very intelligent. He made coherent arguments. And the last thing the U.S. government ever wants you to do is go watch it right now. So if you really want to make Biden mad, you really want to make Donald Trump mad, go and watch that speech because
just too liberal.
Then you'll learn something. That's what I've got to say about that.
Very smart people don't fail easiest invasions in history. Yeah, exactly. Hello from Germany. Oh, I guess it's evening there. So, yeah, hello. Especially the agrarianism in Bulgaria during the early 20s. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, Stamboulski. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, Stamboulski was indeed like a pretty much like important in actually talking to like the Bulgarian peasantry. Where's the difference between peoples and nations? He's talking out of his ass. Yeah, exactly. He won't say it because he's a. What would you say is your political ideology? I would say that it's left-wing nationalism / I would say national communism, but I'll identify more as a left-wing nationalist these days, just to be like less controversial. So yeah, if there's any questions of if I didn't get like some good, so if my points were not like as clear, is there any more questions to what I basically responded to? I'll be very happy to answer because I know I'm not making like I'm not necessarily the clearest guy, but like I try. I'll wait a bit because I know there's always like a delay and so on. What do you think is the most effective way in the 21st century to overturn capitalist societies? These days, that's a pretty good question. I'd probably say to base ourselves more on like a culturalist system. I would say. It's things, for example, that like Bhutan does. For example, like I know Bhutan is not like a socialist country per se, but like Bhutan like has kind of like stopped like thinking in like a form of like GDP, for example. They're thinking of like more national happiness, and they base themselves kind of like on a Bhutanese kind of culturalist system to basically provide for their people. So yeah, I'd probably think that like culturalism is kind of like the answer to kind of overturn the capitalist societies today. However, like the problem is that I'm pretty much aware that it's not like very popular. At least in Europe, it's not. But like in other places such as Asia, for example, or even in certain African countries, like they'll support like this sort of culturalistic approach to say, well, you know what, maybe we should do this because this sort of the full-fledged capitalism isn't quite helping us these days. So might as well just go for that position. So yeah, that was Caleb Maupin. Yeah, I think what I forgot to say is that the guy works for RT, so I think a lot of his positions on Russia might be kind of influenced from basically like kind of like the environment he works in. But yeah, basically, yeah, that's basically he's basically kind of like the king of the Zoids because especially I'd say on the Marxist-Leninist side, because he's been the one basically doing a lot of videos saying, yeah, we need to stop like supporting Ukraine for reason Y and reason Z. So yeah. Let's try and see if I can do this one. Unhinged. Let's see. Because these guys also did like sort of a stream on like why Russia was always like, or like why Russia has always been invaded. If I can find it, because I think it was a live stream, except that they like took it down. I might just do like a quick rebuttal if I don't find it. I can't seem to find it. Okay, so let me try to do like a quick rebuttal on why like this idea of like quote unquote Russia has always been invaded by the West doesn't really hold. Number one, you need to take into account that like Russia throughout basically when it became like a massive empire pretty much kind of embedded itself with the West. I think this is more apparent, especially when Napoleon Bonaparte came basically like rising to power in France and started basically the Napoleonic Wars. One of the main countries that actually like waged war against Napoleon was Russia, and they even helped like the monarchic powers, which were the UK, Spain, and Germany and Austria-Hungary, to basically put down Republican France. Now, obviously, you can basically have like critiques of Napoleon. I'm not defending Napoleon 100%, but to sit here and tell me that like Russia has always been part of it, even like World War One, they'll say like, oh well, World War One was a proxy war against Russia. That's not true because Russia, again, like Russia was very happy to join World War One because by helping the Serbs defeat Austria-Hungary, they could expand into Galicia. So yeah, this idea that like, oh well, poor Russia has always been invaded by the West, it just doesn't hold because Russia for like a very long time was inked in the West. They were actually like buddies with the West, even during the Bolshevik Revolution. Who basically supports like the Western power intervening? It's the Russian monarchists. Even to some extent, the Russian liberals like the Kerenskyites would support like Russia attacking, would basically support like the Entente and Central Powers entering Russia to help them out. But otherwise, I mean, I would say that like the Cold War basically is the only instance really where the West and Russia kind of like fell apart. Afterwards, when Yeltsin and even early Putin came to power, they were very buddy with the West. Like if you look at like Putin's ideology, Putin is basically like an American neoconservative. Like a lot of the arguments that he used for say Chechnya in 1999, a lot of that would come in and do the George W. Bush handbook, what he did to Iraq. And even Putin to invade Ukraine basically did kind of like uses the same rhetoric as George W. Bush did to attack Iraq. What are your thoughts on the African coups that have happened in the past few years? Burkina Faso, Niger, Guinea, Chad, Senegal, Mali, etc. And Russia and France having a proxy war, Wagner versus France. So basically, yeah, my position on like these events is I guess it's like some form of like discontent with eventually the French intervening in the Sahel region. So I mean I'm more of I have a more neutral position on these things because I think that it's mainly like the military that has like interest into becoming like the new leaders. So they're the ones that can profit because I think there's like a straining relation between like say the government and the militaries of these African countries because basically I think they're also tired of like taking orders from France, which is understandable because France again had like their own monopoly in that region, and there was like resources to take in from. However, there are also a lot of African, just normal African people from these countries that say, "Yeah, but hold on, the French were also here to help us against these Islamist groups that basically rose up. What's gonna happen with this?" So there's also like some form of uncertainty. But when it comes to like also like this idea of like a proxy war between France and Wagner, I don't really see it. Mainly in Mali because for those who don't know, there's a war basically being waged by the Malian armed forces with support of Wagner against the Tuaregs in northern Mali. They call it Azawad, and I don't really see any like Western powers supporting like Azawad or saying, "Hey, you need to be nice to the Tuaregs" or so. It's mainly just like, "Oh well, who cares? Like we're just gonna be petty against the coup, the military coup. Otherwise, what really happens inside the country, I don't think that like most of these Western countries actually care. I think they're just there to basically kind of have like, to some extent, you could say that they're there to have like kind of like their colonial administrators to give them resources. But I mean, I would say that that basically Wagner kind of does the same thing. Wagner kind of like supports these coups, saying, "Hey, if we put this guy who's petty against the West in power, then maybe we can be the ones who basically get like the economy and get the resources and get the money." So to some extent, like there is some form of like mercenary imperialism on Russia's part, just kind of like how the U.S. does it with BlackRock and say like the Middle East. Um, but otherwise, like I don't really see like a proxy war because basically France like took their troops and they left. They basically said, "Okay, fuck it, we're out of here." Basically leaving the region to be in this kind of state of like turmoil. I'd say that the African Union has more problems with this because they actually said to these countries, "Okay, you can't be part of the African Union anymore. You need to go to the corner and think of what you've done." So I think that's more of a problem with the African Union at this point. Then the West allied with the whites and the Tsar against Russia during the revolution. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, but that was on invitation of like the Tsarists. And I think certain Kerensky supporters also support like the Entente entering Russia. I'm not completely sure, but I think I heard this a couple of times saying that yeah, even Kerenskyites actually supported the Entente and Central Powers fighting the Bolsheviks. Probably because they were petty that they got couped by Lenin, which is mainly how politics are played these days. So yeah, I think yeah, I think I could. So I think yeah, I think I said what was to be said. If there's anything more that people want me to talk about, anything else, I'm down. Otherwise I'll call this like a quote unquote successful first stream and go get dinner. I'll wait a little bit because I know I'm conscious that there's a delay. It's really quiet. Yeah. Ukrainians are photo Mesopotamians. That's a that's a base name right there. So yeah, I think I'll try to redo a stream maybe like a little bit in the future. Um, Probably like to respond to like an entire series that was done by like Marxist Leninists trying to basically quote unquote debunk Ukrainian nationalism, which is pretty funny. What is your stance on Cuba? So my position on Cuba these days is, I mean, I guess I have to, I mean, it's kind of complicated because I know that like Cubans are necessarily supportive of everything their government does. So I mean, I don't really know their stance on like the whole like the whole like Russia Ukraine debacle. Otherwise, I think that like Cuba, I think really these days I'm feeling like Cuba has like more of a social is basically putting themselves in like a more I mean, I don't know. I mean, I'll have to do more research on Cuba, but from my perspective, is that the government is very supportive of Russia, so I kind of have a problem with that. But like the people are mainly just kind of either indifferent or saying, nah, maybe we shouldn't do that. Maybe we shouldn't get involved, which I probably would support more because yeah, they're not in Europe. It doesn't really concern them all that much. So that's kind of my position on Cuba. I mean, it's pretty milquetoast, but I mean, I just don't know what's really going on there. So yeah. Otherwise, position-wise, if we have to say, or if anyone wants to say, well, do you think that Cuba should be like Marxist or Marxist? I'd probably say, yeah, I think that Cuba should probably be Marxist instead of Marxist. But that's like a different conversation for another time. But yeah, as I was saying, and I'm probably like on the stream like after that, I'll probably do like another stream like either in the future or so, because there's like Marxist Leninists that did like an entire series trying to debunk Ukrainian nationalism, and they just did like a horrible job at it. So I'll probably like nitpick at that. Anywho, I hope that everyone enjoyed this first stream. And yeah, I guess I'll do like a couple of pre-recorded videos as I'm working on like the longer videos, which certain I just had to redo because my script was just shitty, so I had to rewrite a lot of stuff. But yeah, anywho, have a good day, have a good evening if you're in Europe, and yeah, well, I'll see you guys in the next one. Well, yeah, bye bye.